everybody, we're back inside the Magic Circle. This is Jason Augustus Newcomb, and today it is my great delight to speak to someone who I've been asking to have an interview with for quite some time. I'm speaking today with Dr. Jeffrey S. Kupperman, who is a PhD in philosophy and religious studies and the author of the fascinating book Living Theurgy, and he has got a brand new book called The Theurgist Book of Hours that I look forward to talking with him about. I'm talking to Jeffrey Kupperman. Welcome.
Thank you.
So to begin with, I'd like to just ask you a real quick question about your new book, because I'm pretty interested in it. I didn't realize that it had come out until just a little while ago. And so tell me about the book.
So it is sort of a companion to Living Theurgy. The point of Living Theurgy was to have a practical thing to do, and not just here's some information on philosophy, but here's how to actually live the philosophical and theurgic life. So a Theurgist Book of Hours sort of builds on that to give an actual practice to base your life around. It's modeled on the medieval and Renaissance books of hours and the work of Plethon, who was the guy who got the original Greek of Plato and Aristotle for Marsilio Ficino to translate. So we had so he did this whole sort of neo-pagan, 15th century neo-pagan calendar reform that was completely banned, and all his books were burnt. But so it's based on sort of what remains of that.
That sounds really fascinating, and we're going to have to obviously backtrack and get a little bit more information on all of these subjects. But to begin with, a book of hours is sort of it's sort of a practice guide in a way that's structured on a calendar. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's basically a prayer book that divides prayers into, in this case, into different months, different seasons, different phases of the moon. So there are different prayers for each of those. There are, I think, some 200-ish or so prayers and hymns that I wrote for it.
Whoa, terrific. And most of these are your own work, or are they based on those references that you gave a moment ago?
All the prayers are my own.
I thought that your book Living Theurgy was interesting in the fact that there was quite a lot of original material in there, and that material that you used from other sources you seem to use in a fairly in the know sort of way, as opposed to sometimes you see things where people just sort of grab things and stick them in places without necessarily even quite understanding the context that they would have originally been in. But you seem to be fairly conservative in that. I did a survey of people who've drawn stuff from the Greek magical papyri in their works over the last year or so, and yours was one of the most sparing of them, and sort of you know, the bits that you put in were seemed like they belonged rather than that they just were sort of something to fill the space. So what inspired you to create this book of hours?
Largely because I wanted a sort of set practice to go with whatever other things you might be doing. One of the things that sort of can be difficult to get across about theurgy is it's not just a fancy form of ritual magic, though it is that. Proclus especially, but also the Iamblichus, they're pretty clear that your everyday prayer can be theurgic as well, that going to the temple and engaging in the sacrifice and the prayer there, if done properly by you, can be a theurgic experience for you. So I wanted something that wasn't just a bunch of ritual stuff, something that you can be sort of brought into your everyday practice.
There also seems to be a significant amount of denigration of ritual that is intended for sort of sorcerous purposes, like almost a complete dismissal of it on their part, but also Apuleius, the same thing, you know, just sort of like, no, this isn't anything that anyone who's sane would be involved in, which is interesting because it seems like that aspect of magic is really on the rise in our culture right now. So when you say theurgy, and this is a broad question, but what do you mean by that?
That's an excellent question. I guess broadly, they are ritual, and again, in a very broad sense of ritual, or ritualized practices that bring us closer to the divine, and in doing so, help to divinize us as well.
And do you think that doing ritual that's not intended for that, but more for more practical purposes, can also have that divinizing effect? Or do you think that there's something special about the theurgic focus that makes it different?
Yes and no. For example, Proclus is known to have, or is reported to have, ended a drought through a theurgic practice, as opposed to magical or sorcerer's practice. So there is a absolutely practical element to theurgy, that you can engage in a thaumaturgic like practice, but you do so not by manipulating nature, spirits, or things like that, but by aligning your will with the divine will and engaging in demiurgy and divine creative activity.
Iamblichus also, I heard a story, had some children come out of springs or something like that. There seems to be some sort of story along those lines. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, there's a story that he brought a bunch of his students to these hot springs, and that he conjured the spirits of the place for them. Whether or not it's true, it's hard to say. Iamblichus generally plays down any of that sort of stuff that's attributed to him. One of his biographers, which one of his students, wrote that when Iamblichus was in prayer, that he levitated off the ground and turned into gold. And Iamblichus was like, yeah, no. So even if it happened, it's not the point of what he's doing. It's a distraction.
It's funny because Aleister Crowley relates exactly the same story, that one of his students reported that essentially that exact phenomenon. So
yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And you find similar stories in mystical forms of Hinduism, and
Sure.
these cities, these distractions that you're supposed to sort of, yes, you've got these great mystical powers, but who cares? Because that's not what we're doing right now.
Right. Well, I mean, and ultimately, if your agenda is to become one with the divine, any kind of power seems sort of pale in comparison. It's sort of like oh, you can do this little magic trick here, or you can literally become the universe and beyond. So what drew you to this particular aspect of study in your life in general?
I moved through it through actually studying traditional Jewish Kabbalah. And sort of the more I studied that, the more like, well, there are clearly antecedents to this, and enough of like the academic texts and reference the occasional Neoplatonist. And sort of coupled with that, years ago, I picked up a copy of Iamblichus's De Mysteriis, and read it probably like 3 or 4 times before I could make anything of it whatsoever. I mean, it's a fairly dense text.
Which translation were you reading?
The
more recent one.
It's I'm looking at my bookshelf, but I can't find it offhand. It's one of the academic, put out by the Society of Biblical Literature.
Yeah, I know the one.
Yeah. And so I said, okay, I want to write something on this. And Living Theurgy actually started out as being a theurgic grimoire. He said I sort of like telling this sort of story, going from Iamblichus's persona of a Egyptian priest writing for his student. I was going to write the grimoire from the perspective of that student. And so I'd write a bit of mythology, and then try to work a little bit of De Mysteriis into it, and then realize that I had no idea what I was writing about. So go and do some more research, and then write a little bit more, and realize I had no idea what I was writing about, rinse and repeat, until I got to the point I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. I'm going to write something that involves the entire philosophical system, not just the theurgic system, because that's clearly what Iamblichus taught. He taught philosophy, he taught religion, and then he taught theurgy, which then meant like a 3-year study of everything I could possibly find, either written by Iamblichus, which is a woefully small amount compared to what he actually wrote.
Yeah.
And then, all the academia, which at the time I was working at a couple universities, so I had access to interlibrary loan, which is a fantabulous thing that I recommend to all my friends. And that's eventually what became Living Theurgy. But I sort of threw myself into this study. As I threw myself into this study, I became more and more interested in all the elements of it, and that sort of turns into Living Theurgy.
How much of it was a practice, and how much of it was more just amusing on the ideas?
Ultimately, all of it has practical application.
No, I mean for you personally, like.
Oh, for me personally, a little bit of both. I try to put into practice, any of the exercises and whatnot that I had in the book are things that I've done myself. So they led me through what I was doing, helped me refine both the practices and the philosophical or the sort of theoretical elements. But to be fair, I'm an academic. I like knowing things for the sake of knowing things as well. So there is a certain amount of that going on too, certainly.
So at what point in your life did you become even interested in Kabbalah? Was that something that was always with you, or something that came along as an experience?
I sort of start out in the Golden Dawn, as probably thousands of people have, probably around the age of 16 or so. And so I'm sort of studying Regardie, and then I pick up this book called Magick in Theory and Practice by some guy named Aleister Crowley. You might have heard of him. Which again, I couldn't make head or tail of the first several times I read it, but he kept talking about this Kabbalah thing. So as I sort of moved through Golden Dawn work, in and out over a good 25 years or so, I started being interested in the more traditional aspects of Kabbalah that diverge quite greatly in many instances from what you get in the Golden Dawn or in Crowley's practice. And the depth of that is so fascinating. It just sort of took me down a 10-year rabbit hole of read all the things, reading parts of the Zohar, reading Moshe Skedevra, reading Isaac Luria, and so on.
And was this part of academia, or were you doing that as a private study?
This is a private study. Yeah.
So what were you studying for your PhD, and what do you teach?
Something completely unrelated. My doctoral work is in the use of myth and ritual in modern pagan seasonal celebrations. It sort of focuses on theories of myth, theories of ritual, theories of myth and ritual, as well as communication theory, and sort of weaves this path of how all these things are sort of connected, how so many of the rituals that you can find with the group that I studied in particular, as well as online in books, all sort of interweave and connect to one another.
So you joined a pagan group and sat and took notes about what they were doing?
Basically, yeah. I sort of embedded, to use the modern terminology, with a group in Illinois for about a year and a half, and went to the rituals, went to sort of their social functions and things like that.
Well, I mean, that sounds fascinating in and of itself. Can someone, is your dissertation published online somewhere?
It is not. I occasionally toy with the idea of getting it published, but then I realize that I'd have to go and read it again, and I'm just not up for that at this point, and it's been like 15 years, and I'm just like, yeah, I still can't do it.
I know the feeling. Every time I open one of my books, I'm like, oh, I can't believe I wrote that. So, were you practicing with this group, or were you just sitting and watching them?
I mean, I was involved in the ritual. I didn't have, any officer roles or anything like that, but I was in the circle, reading with the script and things like that.
And so, what tradition of neo-paganism was this a part of?
It was an American Wiccan tradition.
Okay, so sort of non-denominational Wiccan or Gardnerian influence, or just curious.
They drew on, elements of like Cunningham and the Farrars, sort of all of the usual sort of early Wiccan authors, and drew bits and pieces. And so, all of them, and did it quite well too.
So this was the early 2000s that you were doing that?
Yeah, I started in 2004.
And so, how do you see that community as having transformed as the internet really took flight over the last 15 years? Have you kept in touch with those people? Or?
A couple of them. Some of them I'm Facebook friends with. Some I am good friends with, though they live in another state for me, so that becomes interesting. Beyond that, I haven't really kept up on that very much. I've moved into sort of more of the ritual magic again, and sort of the Theurgist stuff. Mm-hmm. So, I studied what I did. The advice that I got is that when you do your doctorate, study something that you're interested in, but not something that you're in love with, because you will hate it by the time you're done. And that isn't entirely true in my case, but I was kind of done with it when I was finished.
With American Wicca, or the whole concept of seasonal festivals and all that stuff? Because I mean,
I'm studying Wicca in general. It just hasn't been something that I have gotten more into.
Well, I mean, obviously you've kind of looked the other direction. Wicca is an emergent religion, and you're sort of focused more in the past, in the antiquity. So, did you ever join a Golden Dawn group at all, or formalize any kind of group ritual activities in that community, or?
Yeah, I'm actually an active member in a Golden Dawn order.
Oh, okay, interesting. And so the Golden Dawn system, obviously, it's sort of a bridge in some ways between sort of that modern American Wicca, and then everything that precedes it. And so, do you feel comfortable in that situation, or do you feel like you get jangled by some of the things that are a little bit off from what you know to be so? Or
some of the Kabbalistic things throw me for a loop. So then they're somewhat dyslexic, switching the right and left paths sometimes, which throws me off sometimes. My pronunciation tends towards modern Israeli Hebrew as opposed to the god-awful Victorian Hebrew pronunciation of things. But for the most part, at least with the temple that I'm with, they absolutely grok to my studying of traditional Kabbalah, of theurgy. I'm not by any means the only member of that temple who has gone down that rabbit hole.
It seems like a tempting hole, since it disconnects us from some of the cultural problems that we've had with religion over the last couple of centuries, while at the same time having a root into deeper places. So when you kind of when did you discover you were interested in Crowley, and you were beginning to study with American Wicca as well? When did you discover that there was this sort of ancient theurgical stuff that was somewhat murky, but there.
You know, I probably didn't become like really aware of until the 2000s. You know, you read, you know, the occasional reference. I mean, Crowley, you know, scatters any philosopher's name he can around
Sure.
around his book. So I'd certainly seen like Iamblichus, and I've seen the word theurgy, but I didn't really look into it at that time. So it was really in the 2000s I sort of had been put a hold on my Golden Dawn work for a while. And as I said, you know, I sort of rediscovered Iamblichus and De Mysteriis and whatnot. So probably really then, because I didn't connect like the PMG, the Greek Magic Papyri, with Theurgic practice at that time. It was, to me, that was just sort of this interesting sort of sorceress stuff.
Fairly
That
bizarre.
was, which I was sort of able to connect then through, you know, the names of evocation that Iamblichus and Proclus talk about, but don't actually mention. And there seems like that clear connection between the two there.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about these fellas that you've been mentioning. They're all Neoplatonists, or sort of Neo-Pythagorean Neoplatonists. Those are our terms that we use to describe them. I don't know that they would have known quite what we meant if we if we said that at the time. But describe their sort of philosophical underpinnings.
Okay, so you know, Iamblichus is the person that I've studied the most, and he's around the mid 300 CE or so. I mean, it's sort of trite, but it's also accurate to say his philosophical underpinnings are Platonism. You know, the later Platonists, the Neoplatonists, whatever you wanted to call themselves, called themselves Platonists. That they didn't understand themselves as being anything new or different from the line of Platonic thought. It's just that over 1300 years or so, Platonic thought had changed, which we'd expect it to do over 1300 years.
Sure.
And so Iamblichus, he was a Platonist. He studied with Plotinus. He studied with an Aristotelian as well. So he would have understood himself as both a Platonist, but also very much as a Pythagorean, which I think he does refer himself to as well as a Hermetist. You know, he studied the Hermetic texts as well.
Sure. I mean, he wrote several books about Pythagoras anyway. And do we have two of them that are extant, or one? I can't remember.
He wrote 9 or 10. 4 or 5 survive incomplete. I think only 3 or so have been translated into English. And then we have fragments of, I think, 2 or 3 more, like very small fragments.
So you know, a Platonist is someone who studies Plato, but there's different aspects of Platonism. There obviously there's the dialogues, but then there's an underlying philosophy that is not as explicitly communicated. So do you feel like that's consistent throughout, or by the time we reach Iamblichus, that too has pretty significantly changed?
I think it's hard to say. According to Aristotle, Socrates taught unwritten things. So there's this verbal tradition that's passed on. That, as far as I know, we know absolutely nothing about. Assuming that it's true, and there does seem to be some reason to believe that it is, I can only assume that it too changed over time. I think Iamblichus, though, does also present some really new things. It's really with Iamblichus that theurgy is brought into Platonic practice. We know Plotinus and Porphyry probably did some things with it, but it clearly wasn't their thing. Porphyry appears to reject it eventually. So it's Iamblichus and his school in Apamea in Syria that really starts teaching it. And he has students that go on to teach in the Platonic Academy in Athens, where theurgic practice gets established really for the rest of the history of the academy until it's closed down, with only a few exceptions of successors who weren't into it. But for the most part, the Platonic successors are like, and we're doing this now too. So in Iamblichus, it appears to be the very last things that he taught. He seems to have started with Aristotle and then Pythagoras, and then moved into the Platonic and Socratic teachings, and then religious teachings. And he's known to have written a couple books on the gods. One from a Syrian perspective, he was considered an expert on Syrian religion, and one from a Pythagorean perspective. He wrote a book, The Gods, or On the Gods, that we've lost, of course. And then after that, then he taught theurgic practice. So he really made sure there was this profound foundation in philosophical and religious practice before he even let you touch the theurgic stuff.
So we're going to continue talking about theurgy, and we're going to get a little bit more clear on what it entails. But I just want to stay with Plato for a second. What we do kind of understand about his perspective is that the intention of philosophy is to perceive the world beyond the material world, and to see sort of the archetypes or forms, or the world of truth, essentially, rather than this sort of temporary world that we live in. And so was he suggesting that you do that in a ritualized way, or was he suggesting a dialectic way, or is dialectic something different? Fill me in.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's no evidence that Plato engaged in ritual practice. His process would have been through the dialectic, through the Socratic method, that seems to lead to a higher state of consciousness, to see these divine realms, as it were, the realms of the eternal and the unchanging, the forms and the gods, and then eventually in Neoplatonic thought, the one itself, though it's questionable as to whether or not Plato himself understood his discussion of the one to actually be talking about a divine realm or not. There's debate over that.
Elaborate, and what's your opinion?
From reading the dialogue, and of course I absolutely am spacing on the name of which one it is.
Sure.
Where he talks about the one, and he goes through these hypotheses, trying to explain, if the one is, or if the one is not. They're all seem to be entirely hypothetical sorts of things that I think the later Platonists took as being not hypothetical. But I think from like Plato's perspective, they probably were mental exercises to sort of try to get around how to understand what is and what is not. It's very ontological sort of text.
There's an interesting dialogue, again, I can't remember which one, in which Socrates is speaking to someone about memory and about learning, and that all learning is remembering how to do things. And then he brings a servant boy in and basically teaches him about squares and how that mathematically works out. And basically he says this is a demonstration of how learning works, because the boy understood how to do it. He just needed to be shown how to get to that information. I didn't tell him anything. He just sort of figured it out on his own. But the the process is extremely leading. So it seems like in order to have that kind of a dialogue in which you would get to a higher plane, the other person would actually have to be on the higher plane and helping you to remember how to get there, as opposed to the two of you could just talk about it until you reached that point. It seems like there's a requirement of a person in the know to have the dialogue in the first place.
Right. And if you read the commentaries on the dialogues by Iamblichus and Proclus, they're pretty explicit about that. They actually interpret some of the characters in the dialogues as being these sort of higher beings, or as Socrates being this very divine sort of figure, and that he takes that role as sort of this semi-divine interlocutor that leads his audience to these higher realms.
So one of the things that that seems to come out in the later Platonist writings is that the Chaldean oracles become more and more important to what it is that they're doing. And so what do you think the connection is between the Chaldean oracles and Platonism?
It's an interesting question. According to at least one tradition, the Julian the philosopher and his son Julian the Theurgist, that Julian, the elder Julian, invoked the spirit of either Socrates or Plato into his son, and it's that soul that is actually giving forth excuse me, the oracles themselves. So mythologically, they sort of come from the horse's mouth. Iamblichus is known to have written, or thought to have written, like 32 books on the oracles, all of which have been lost, of course. So he clearly saw a connection between what he was doing and the oracles. And I think there is sort of a cosmological bent in the oracles that sort of partakes of some sort of the Middle Platonist and Neoplatonist cosmologies as well. There's a lot to do with Hecate as the world soul,
right?
For instance.
I was going to. That's really kind of where I was coming from. Is that if the Chaldean oracles represents a Platonic worldview, that's very different from what we get from the dialogues, or even what we get, in slightly later things. It seems like it's an interesting moment in that. And aren't there sort of contemporary writings that suggest that they thought that they were a fraud or something like that as well? So it's almost like this sort of channeled writings had this incredible transformative effect upon a philosophy that is viewed as being sort of central to our culture.
And it's sort of weird because, I mean, as I said, they're basically channeled writings,
right?
Which I think a lot of us today would look at some of the modern channeled writings and say no thank you to, but we're absolutely fine with the oracles. I certainly sprinkle bits and pieces of them throughout Living Theurgy, because they're just so good and useful, as sort of laying a visual overlay to the cosmology that I'm working with. So
let's get into it a little bit here. Hold on a sec. I just lost you. So what is the end in mind for doing the theurgical practices in Living Theurgy?
In Living Theurgy, the end really culminates in the invocation of the personal daemon, like the Holy Guardian Angel from the Abramelin work. And to be fair, a certain amount of that ritual work is inspired by the Abramelin work, because there's a lot of good stuff in there. So gaining the name of the daemon, understanding, you know, the what of the planetary gods your soul has been sewn into, the orbit of, that's sort of the main goal of that text. That said, I consider that to really be the beginning point of theurgic practice. Whereas in some modern magical practice, you know, the Abramelin, the Holy Guardian Angel, sort of like the end goal of what you did. Now you know this and you're a master and stuff like that. But for me, it's really not. It's really the beginning point.
If that has seeped into modern culture, I think that that's something that is related to the way that people look at materials. Because I mean that even, you know, if we take the sort of the coiners of it, the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley, that wasn't viewed as the end at all. It was viewed as going out of the first order into the second order, and there surely was a lot more work to be done after that. So you kind of equate the personal daemon and the Holy Guardian Angel, because I know there's some discussion about this these days.
I think in practice they are probably the same thing, which is not to say that in reality beyond practice they're necessarily the same thing. If so, you know, if I'm dealing with my daemon, it does certain things, and those certain things seem to be the certain things that the Holy and Guardian Angel also does. Whether or not in the spheres that those beings actually exist, they're the same thing, I don't know exactly. But in practice, it doesn't necessarily matter.
I mean, I think the reason that Crowley adopted the term Holy Guardian Angel, which you know, I get into arguments with people about this sometimes, but I mean, his work really coins that term into modern culture, not him imitating the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage, but you know, in the Golden Dawn, which he was really mimicking himself, it was called the higher genius or the divine genius, and so he adopts this Holy Guardian Angel term into that same thing. But I mean, I don't know that he wouldn't have chosen a different word if he'd felt freer to do so. I mean, he was in a reality tunnel that, you know, we all operate within the parameters of what we've been presented, and so for him, that seemed like the most logical nomenclature. But had he been more familiar with some of the stuff that you're familiar with, well, I'm not asking you to speculate on somebody else's life, but it seems possible that he might have chosen the personal daemon as a term. And in fact, he might even in one or two places kind of use that word in a list of different possible names for it. So I mean, I get what you're saying though, because they're not necessarily, you know, obviously the words impact what things are, right? But I mean, certainly the word angel specifically is a messenger, and the word daemon is sort of a power or a fate. So they're different, you know, from their etymologies as well. I mean, and it seems like the modern concept encompasses both, right? I mean, you're connecting with the divine through that, but at the same time, you're being guided by it. So maybe it is the same thing. I don't know. So your book ends sort of at that as the culmination. What's the next step after that?
That's pretty much between you and your daemon. At that point, Iamblichus is pretty clear. If you are in contact with your daemon, it will now teach you. And so whatever it thinks you should be doing to make you realize the you that is really you, the essential you, the essential you, essentially in the Platonic understanding of the term, it will now lead you towards that.
couple questions jump to mind from that. First of all, the more personal one. Do you feel like you're in contact with your daemon and that you are being guided?
Yes, as I said, I did go through all of the exercises. So I mean all of the exercises. So I didn't put anything out there that I haven't already done myself and found to be successful.
Always a good recommendation for any author out there. What is the fail-safe within your theurgical practice or theurgy in general against the possibility of a person connected with something else, either a part of their own ego or some other entity that is not necessarily their daemon? How does one prevent that from happening?
Largely, it's done through the sort of gradual working up process, so that if you're doing it correctly, and that's the big if, I guess,
right.
It leads you experientially towards this sort of end goal. And I can't tell you what the experience is going to be, because yours will likely be different from mine, because your soul is not my soul, right? Your daemon is different from my daemon, and so on. But the experience themselves, because I've talked to people who have gone through it, who probably shouldn't have, and who I've recommended not to, but they did it anyway. And their life sort of went to hell as they were doing it, which is not the response that you should be getting. I mean, they were getting like poltergeist experiences and things like that are utterly unrelated to the work that should have been going on.
Is there a purification that they should have been working on before that or something?
The ritual itself has those built into it. So I don't know exactly what they were doing, because I didn't go into their exact practice, if they were actually doing, what I said in the book, or where, and I don't, and from the little bit that we talked about, beforehand, they did not seem to be in a psychological place where I would recommend anyone should do any ritual practice whatsoever.
What are the specific red flags that you saw in there? Without getting personal, but
yeah, and this was a while ago, so I'm sort of trying to draw on what I can remember of it. It's sort of this sort of interesting combination of, the gods come down and talk to him whenever he wants to, but he's also plagued by demons at the same time, which seems like two great tastes that don't go great together.
Right.
If you are that in tune with the gods and they don't come down and talk to you, that's just not a thing. You should also not be plagued by demons, because you should be in a spiritual place where they can't really do that, so it's like, yeah, maybe this is not the best practice for you at this time, was my advice, and that was apparently ignored. So
did any of the people that came from that place finish the practice, or did you lose touch with them before finding out?
He came back to me later saying that my practice didn't work because all these bad things happened to him. After, I said, you really shouldn't be doing this. He didn't, as far as I can tell, complete the ritual the way it should be. There was no contact with his daemon, from what I understood of what I was being told.
I'd also question, if someone is already in contact with the gods and with demons, what do they need? They're already involved in some sort of theurgic life anyway, right? So
right. In fact, there's sort of a progression in De Mysterious that sort of implied that eventually the daemon will teach you everything that it can, and it will hand you off to the next sort of level of spiritual being, which is an angel, and then an archangel, and then the gods themselves. And there's a story about Plotinus that he went to this great Egyptian seer who was going to invoke his daemon, and a god showed up.
Right. Again, that's sort of a sales pitch, though, right? So we don't know whether and it was actually written by one of his students. So, it's a little hard to know quite, along with the various thaumaturgical things, exactly what's going on in that storytelling. So have you had people who've gone through your whole program who've then come back and reported, my goodness, my life has been transformed in this amazing way?
Interestingly, I have not. I know a lot of people who've read it. No one's come back to me and said, I've done all the things, which doesn't mean that there isn't. I don't know if it's simply because nobody thinks to go and say, hey, I should contact the author, or if no one's done it, or they just don't want to talk about it. I mean, it's a very personal sort of experience.
It is. I wrote a book that had a sort of a practice structure that would take you in, and I actually started a Yahoo group. So this was a while ago on the subject, and every single person who posted on it was asking about the first few sections of it, and I really hoped that people were going to kind of move through it, not super fast, but that people would get through the material and move on. But nobody would talk about anything but those first couple of things. And so finally I decided to create a course, and I have actually managed to have some people get through the course and be enriched by it by doing that. But I basically had to drag them along to really keep them, focus on moving forward. Rather, there's this incredible tendency, and I still see it to this day when people interact with me, to sort of get stuck on things and think, I haven't quite perfected this, so I'm just going to stay right here until it's 100% exactly the way that I imagine that it might be, which is, of course, a theoretically impossible thing to achieve, because there's no, you've made up an answer that isn't necessarily the answer, and so until it gets to that answer that you've made up, you're not going to move on, and so you're going to just stay in this circle forever, trying to achieve something that isn't necessarily even possible from the thing that you're asking for. But anyway, I digress. Your own personal experience of success with these tools, while it wouldn't resemble anybody else's, can you tell me a little bit about that experience and what it was like?
It's sort of hard to put into words. A lot of it was very sensational. I mean, there were feelings of things happening, sometimes, that accompanied by, I don't want to say visions in the sort of prophetic way, but like in the, scrying sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's this suddenly at the end of the work, we're actually doing the invocation of the daemon. It's there, and it sort of fills your consciousness. There's this movie that came out like a year or two ago, and I don't remember what it's called, but it purports to be doing the Abramelin ritual,
mm-hmm.
and it has absolutely nothing to do with that.
It's a horror film, right? You're talking about?
Yeah, but at the end, the angel is just, there, and it fills her consciousness. And if nothing else, that sort of image probably best represents the kind of thing that you might get. And of course, it will appear however it's going to appear to you, related to the nature of your soul, related to the the planetary god that you're associated with, and so on. But it's just there, and you sort of talk to it And my experience is that it's an absolute pain in the ass. Um, it's not this, angelic, lovely, comforting thing. It's this being that has a job to get you someplace, and that's what it's going to do. It's not there to comfort you, to make you feel good about yourself, to make you feel that you're one with the universe. That's the work that you have to do. And it will say, do this thing and don't talk to me until you've done it. And then if you try to call it up before you've done what it wants you to do, it basically ignores you or says, I told you to do the thing, go do the thing.
Is the Theurgist Book of Hours one of the things that you were told to do?
No, actually. Though it might sort of serendipitously have been. I basically wrote the book of Hours pretty much at. Okay, I'm going to take that back. Now that I think about it, the first thing that I was told to do was pray more. And I was told that a number of times. And then, like, the next, I was a Freemason at the time. And then, like, the next time we had new officers, the next time that happened, I was made the lodge chaplain, which meant I was doing the prayers.
Doing all the prayers, yeah.
And then, and of course, because it's me, I wrote my own prayers for each one. So it's like, you crafty SOB. Okay. And then I came across these articles on Plethon's calendar reform and his prayers. So now that you've asked the question, the answer is probably yes, but I didn't see it as such at the time.
So there are a couple places in Plato's dialogues where there is mention of a daemon in one way or another. The first is obviously Socrates was guided by something, and his way of talking about it was that he was basically told not to do things by this being. Like whenever he was about to do something stupid, the being would step in and say, don't do that, which is why he felt confident in allowing the Athenians to kill him, because his guide had not given him the advice not to do the things he'd planned to do. So he knew it was the right thing to do, which is I think a pretty funny and interesting, one of the charming things in Plato's dialogues, that particular speech and the story surrounding it is pretty good. And that's in Apology, I believe. So if anyone wants to check it out, it's pretty interesting. And also Marcus Aurelius also has a similar thing in his Meditations, but this concept that death isn't necessarily a bad thing, very well spoken presentation of that concept in that dialogue, and also in the Meditations. I think they're similar to one another in some ways.
Socrates is absolutely, I think, clear. The point of philosophy is to prepare for death. Mm-hmm. So that may not be an exact quotation, but it's a pretty close paraphrase. For him, it seems pretty clear that death is not something to be feared. Basically, I think he says, look, if there's nothing afterwards, then what's to fear? There's nothing. You're gone. And if there is something afterwards, then I get to be in the company of the sages, and that's also awesome.
Right. So they're both good conclusions. You don't need to fear death anymore.
Yeah.
So that's one place where it's mentioned, and then another place is in the story of where when a soul is about to be incarnated, they gather by lots their daemon, and that is the guide of their life. Some people get good ones and some people get bad ones. Not bad daemons, but bad lives as a result of maybe their misdeeds or whatever. That there seems to be some sort of balancing force in there. So do you feel that those two things are the same thing being described, or are they two different things?
I think that for Plato, they were probably not the same thing. Platonists, they probably were the same thing. I think they interpreted those things quite differently. Voice that Socrates has, it is, as it says, it basically tells him not to do things, and that's about it. Whereas the daemon in later lore has a more hands-on guiding you, even if you don't know it, sort of role. That it's nudging you in certain directions, even when it's not specifically telling you do this, don't do that. That there is more of a knowledge of it than what Socrates describes of his voice.
I mean, of course, we only get that little snippet of what he thought the voice that was really. I mean, there might be one other mention of it, or maybe even two, but they're basically in passing, and no more real information is shared. So, do you think that the Platonists of the time period where theurgy was really coming in thought those were both the same thing, or did they think them different as well?
I would expect that they did. I'm trying to remember if Augustus says anything in particular about it, and I just can't recall. But they seem like the sorts of things that are similar enough that it would be taken that one is an aspect of the other.
Mm-hmm. and so if this is a weird question, but if the daemon is guiding you, whether you're aware of it or not, what's the actual advantage of doing a bunch of prayer to connect with it if it's there anyway?
Yeah, well, the one thing is that if it is simply guiding you, nudging you, it's really easy to ignore. Whereas where it's telling you, you can ignore it, but you're now ignoring it in full consciousness that you're doing it, as opposed to simply not being aware of its promptings. So I think that is a significant advantage for most of us. We just sort of go through life, and occasionally we are in the right spiritual frame where we get a sort of glimpse of the daemon and what it wants us to do. But for the most part, it's nudging us and mostly going because we're unaware of it and we're ignoring it.
So another wonderful little story in the dialogues is I think it's in the Republic, the allegory of the cave, where our existence as we know it is basically just shadows on the edge of the cave. At a certain point, you can turn around if you're very brave and see that there's actually a world of the fire that it illuminates you from behind and puts them on the cave. And then if you're even braver, you could theoretically find the entrance to the cave, walk out of the cave, and enter the real world and see the true sun and see the true existence that we all have. Within that allegory, where do you see this conscious connection with the daemon?
So there are, I guess, two ways that I might look at it. I used to teach this when I taught philosophy. It's one of my favorite things. Because it's not just that you are leaving the cave, but you're basically being dragged kicking and screaming by someone.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
In Plato, that's a philosopher. The philosopher is the one who has ultimately left the cave, has entered the real world, which is the noeric or the noetic realm of pure intellect, has seen the forms, and then goes back into the cave, voluntarily weakening themselves, being blinded by gross matter, and trying to drag people out as they were dragged out themselves. I think allegorically we can apply this to the daemon as well, except that at some point we're the ones who have to remove our shackles in the first place by trying to contact the daemon. Whereas in the philosophical model, I think the philosopher is like, and we're getting you out of here now, whether you like it or not.
Do you think that it's really possible for us to escape the cave, so to speak, without, you know, a living philosopher dragging us along?
While I would love to think so, yes. I don't really know, because even if we look at like Socrates as our example, he had the voice that guided him, right? And then he guided others who guided others. So we don't have in the Platonic tradition, at least, this sort of philosopher outside of Socrates himself who did it all by themselves and now is teaching us. Our first person had this voice, this divine connection that helped. So I don't really know that we can, like, by just pure force of will, do this. That said, I don't know that in having a philosopher lead us, that it has to be an actual living person. We have thousands of years of philosophy to draw on that we can teach ourselves with. We have thousands of years of esoteric practice that we can teach ourselves with. So I think there is a foundation already there that can act as the philosophical guide who leads us on the path. I don't know that it has to be an actual living person to do it.
Our connection has gotten unstable. Hopefully it's going to pick back up in a second.
You froze
here.
For a second.
Yeah. There we go. We're back. We're back. Hopefully that all ended up there. And if it didn't, then it's just between you and me. So the book of hours that you've just created, do you see that more of use as a starting point along with the living theurgy, or do you see it as something that someone would continue with after they've gone through living theurgy?
Yes, I think it's something that you can do parallel to living theurgy, but I don't see it as a practice that needs to stop or has any really good reason to stop after you've contacted the daemon. It still is a practice that is designed to connect us with the divine life. So it is still a theurgical practice. And again, Iamblichus and Proclus, their theurgical practices included prayer, everyday prayer. They didn't say prayer had to be the special thing with the barbarous names of evocation and whatnot. It seems clear that they included that, but we have prayers from Proclus that have survived, a handful of them, that don't include any of that. They just seem to be, standard written in hexameter prayers that like you would find like the Homeric prayers and whatnot. But he also seemed to have expected those to be theurgical practices.
When your daemon instructed you to pray more, to whom was your daemon instructing you to pray?
It was not specific. Because of the deific sphere, planetary deity in whose orbit my soul has been sown, I presumed that was the proper deity. I am comfortable working with that in the Greek mode. I don't expect everyone who goes through the ritual to necessarily get a Greek response to it. You may very well get an Egyptian or Roman or Norse or Celtic or even possibly, Jewish or Christian sort of manifestation of that, which does work in almost all of those traditions. Judaism, especially, which has a tradition of various nations being allotted to the protection of different angels and such.
Do you see a prayer to a god who is sort of down from the monad as being ultimately leading towards a connection with the monad, or is our destiny sort of to connect with that crystallization of divinity that we're born in?
Yes, it's sort of a stepping stone. You move sort of upwards, through, into the psyche realm, the realm of the soul, and the daemons and heroes that have activity there, into the Noeric realm, where various gods have functions, do things there, and then into the Noetic realm, where very frequently those same gods have different functions there, which ultimately leads up to the one, to the monad. So I think there's sort of an upward movement.
Is there a point
At the same time,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
At the same time, in Iamblichus and onward, there doesn't seem to be an intimation that we stay at that highest level. In Plotinus, like, you ascend to have the vision of the one, and you basically stay in that state forever, never to reincarnate. That's not how it is in Iamblichus. There is always a cycle of reincarnation. We're always meant to be here. Eventually we reincarnate as sort of higher, more purified beings. Our soul becomes more purified, so that we can incarnate in such a way where we recognize that we have a body, but that we are not our body, and we recognize that on an experiential as opposed to an intellectual level, so that we're always sort of working with the sphere within which our soul is related to. We're always working with the demiurge, the creative solar god. We're always working on theosis. We're always working on henosis, but it's a cyclical sort of process. There's a going and coming that Proclus talks about. That you go and then you remain in this divine state, and then you come back into incarnation, and then you leave incarnation and you go back into the divine state and stay there for a while, and then come back, basically for as long as the universe exists. And for Proclus, the universe is an eternal, endless plane, so basically forever.
There seems to be a lot of parallels between Buddhism and its various forms and philosophy in its various forms, this ancient philosophy. I mean, there's so many parallels from the sort of the simplicity of the early teachings and the greater complexity as it grows, to the sense that there's a certain point where some people say, no, this is the stopping point, and other people say, no, it's much higher than that, it's actually there. And then this idea of sort of reincarnating and being of service, and that being an essential component of it. They all seem to really be pretty symmetrical, like these concepts. There seems to be very little way that you can really argue with either, although their internal focus might be a little bit different, but it's like the superstructure of it somehow seems almost identical over time. Do you feel like the particular sort of planetary sphere that your soul is associated with, is that a permanent thing? You'll always be, your soul is of this and will continue in that, or over the course of different incarnations will you be sort of associated with different ones?
Yeah. I will answer that. I actually wanted to talk about your Buddhism
absolutely.
connection. Dr. Gregory Shaw, who is one of the foremost scholars on the subject of Neoplatonism, he actually, I think, wrote a paper. He has a thesis that the theurgic sage is the equivalent to a bodhisattva. So he makes a very explicit connection between the ideologies, between Neoplatonic thought and Buddhist thought. Which I think is quite interesting. As to your specific question, I currently only have the one incarnation to draw from to talk about, but the material suggests that this is the permanent abode of your soul. So if you are of the sphere of Helios, you are always of the sphere of Helios. If you are of Aphrodite, it is always of Aphrodite.
And if you feel that you are drawn to a particular planet, is that likely the one that you're associated with, or can that be completely different than what you find out to be true?
It can be completely different. Augustus actually talks about this explicitly in De Mysteriis. Because there are different ways that we incarnate with more or less knowledge of ourself as souls and our daemons. When we incarnate, he calls it, we project a life into the physical realm, and we actually get to choose what that life is going to be like. We choose what planetary sphere it will be influenced in that life. We can choose wrong. We can choose in ignorance, as opposed to a theurgic practitioner who is more likely to choose the correct, that which aligns with their soul, as opposed to the theurgic sage who will always choose that because their will is always in line with the divine will.
So one final question on this subject, then I'm going to let you go because we've been talking for a while, I think, at this point. But and then I have one final question. But so in De Mysteriis, there's a suggestion that there are different kinds of rituals for different sort of levels of soul, that certain people should be doing just sort of purification practices, certain people should be doing the sort of middle practices, and then the highest are doing mostly sort of internal practices. This too also seems to relate in some ways to Buddhism as well. But where do you think that your book falls in terms of those kinds of practice? And are you conscious of that in what you're teaching, so that people who really should just be doing the purification practices, like for instance that person that you were talking about, perhaps they should have read that section and thought about it.
Right. So he talks about basically there are material theurgic practices, intermediate theurgic practices, and then immaterial theurgic practice, with the intermediate ones partaking of both the material and immaterial practices. He, of course, tells us absolutely nothing about what the immaterial practice is, presumably because if you're at that level, you don't need to be told that you have already done all of that sort of stuff. Though Dr. Shaw hypothesizes that it is actually the sacrificing of numbers, whatever that might mean. Living theurgy is very much of the first category. It is part material theurgy. It is for the theurgist who is the person who is just starting out in theurgy so far as they know.
And what do you suppose the middle theurgy would be in comparison with that?
Again, Augustus says it's a sort of combination between material practices and immaterial practices. What exactly that might entail, I'm not certain. Likely, and again, this is me sort of hypothesizing off the top of my head, it is some of the purificatory practices may not be necessary. I would imagine there's probably a more emphasis on prayer, sacrifice not of animals, but maybe of incense, less material things, as well as whatever that spiritual, immaterial communing with the gods might be.
Sure.
I'm just going to go out and say that I'm not really at that level yet. So I'm kind of guessing.
So, final question. I've been asking this of a lot of people. So, if you were to give one piece of advice to a person who's just getting started in theurgy or magical practice, any sort of esoteric study, that perhaps you didn't get the piece of advice and you wish you had, or just your sage wisdom, what would you say to a young person who's getting started, or an old person who's just getting started?
I would say you need to study philosophy. That there is an intellectual foundation that the study of philosophy brings. I'm basically stealing Aristotle here. But philosophy isn't just an intellectual practice, it is a way of life. And esoteric practice, I think, ultimately for a lot of people becomes a way of life that is entirely in tune with most of the traditional forms of philosophical practice. Really, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, for the most part, but even, well, maybe not the Epicureans. I think studying philosophy helps give you the discipline to study and practice esotericism, which I think ultimately demands even more of us than what philosophy does. And I think that's ultimately why Iamblichus says, you want to study this stuff, we're going to start you with Aristotle, we're going to start you with Pythagoras, we're going to start you with the philosophical way of life. If you can't do that, maybe esoteric practice is not your best call at this point.